site. It's pretty impressive when you see it all. The Cliff Palace has about 150 rooms, 21 kivas. That includes the 10 rooms that are up on that upper shelf. You can't see that from the overlook, so that's why you guys paid your money to come down here and see it. But Cliff Palace really has two stories to tell. First story is, of course, the people that came down here, built this beautiful village in this alcove, and eventually left this place. The second story is of the people that came back here, rediscovered the sites, and stabilized them and preserved them for future generations. And of course, they're all intertwined together. But it all begins way back in the year 8550, when we believe people started moving up into this area onto the mesa itself. So back then, people were very simple. They were hunter-gatherers, moving around a lot, gathering wild plants, hunting wild animals. They lived in simple homes called pit houses. There were small holes dug down into the ground with a roof coming up over the top. And you would enter a pit house through a ladder in a home ceiling and climb down inside. But you live in there with your family, about 5 to 7 different people. So I can imagine it would be pretty cramped and uncomfortable in there. It might smell kind of weird in the pit house too. But they lived in one pit house for one part of the year, then they'd move off to another pit house for the rest of the year. So they were okay with that mobile lifestyle. But eventually a very key change took place in their society, and that was the development of agriculture. People here started planting corn, beans, and squash, all on top of the mesas here. I don't know if you've spent too much time in the park, but you might have noticed that we have a lot of cactus growing here. Normally corn and cactus do not grow together, but the people here made that work. In order to do so, they had to become more sedentary, couldn't move around nearly as much, had to take care of their crops. They also had to be more concerned with storage, because you can't store your harvest in an underground pit house for very long. Of course, starts to mold, where the rats and the rodents start to come in. So they started building above ground storage facilities, and they used a technique called yakal, or wattle and daub. When you take wooden logs, stick them straight up in the air around the perimeter of the building that you're making. Then you take sticks and twigs and weave them in between those logs. And when that dries, and that's all ready, then you cover all that with mud. And it becomes very watertight inside as it dries. So you can store your food in there for an extended period of time without it going bad, and then you have a surplus food supply. So with that success, the people and their population started to expand quite a bit. And later on, they started to experiment with stone masonry. People here started carving bricks out of the sandstone that you see all throughout this environment. The mortar that they used came from the soil that was here. It has a very high clay content. One of the reasons why the walls are still standing today. It's very, very strong. But they're still building their homes on top of the mesas. They were living on top of the mesas for about 600 years. Then around the years 1180 to 1190, they moved down into the alcoves here. Happened very quickly, so quickly in fact that a lot of the homes and villages up top were dismantled and their materials were recycled here inside. So many different reasons why they'd come down here. Some people suggest that there wasn't enough fertile cropland for everybody up top as their populations were expanding. So they moved their homes down below and planted food there instead, perhaps. Others suggest that because there wasn't much cover in the area, because they were clearing out trees for their cropland, clearing out trees for their fuel and their firewood and their construction material, but there wasn't a lot of natural cover up above. And here in this area of Colorado, we get the most cloud-to-ground lightning strikes in the whole state. So if you're living on top of the mesa with nothing above you and a lightning storm comes rolling through, you might get a little freaked out and want to move down into the cliffs here. But maybe it was water. Water is a good reason. Many of these alcoves here have seep springs located in the back, so they maybe come down here to be closer to the water supply. Others suggest they move down to defend their water supply. These sites, people have been saying that these sites are defensive for years and years and years, and you can't really argue with that because they're very difficult to find, and once you do find them, they're even more difficult to get into. But here in this park, we don't have too much evidence of violence. Evidence of violence would be battle wounds, arrowheads found in bodies, scattered bones as if someone wasn't buried. But we don't find that evidence here in this park. We find it outside of the park, kind of down around where Cortez is located in the Montezuma Valley and also around Durango. So maybe just the threat of violence drove them down here, because the threat of violence in our own society is enough to make us do some pretty weird things today. But as they came down, They only lived here for about 80 to 100 years, and they were constructing this place for the entire time. The oldest part of the site is over here on the left, and as their population continued to grow and expand, they built out and down in a terrace fashion. That makes Cliff Palace pretty unique, and there's so many different levels here. But as they were coming down, they built this up to be the biggest cliff dwelling in the whole park. But there's 600 of them here, but half of them are just small storage sites. 1 or 2 room granaries that are all throughout the park. But out of the 300 residential sites that we have here, 95% of them are just 10 rooms or less. So very, very small. So we believe that Cliff Palace here, the largest one, was built as a kind of a gathering place. I think people would come from all over the mesa here to gather for trade, for ceremony, even just to socialize with one another. As you guys are coming down along the path, you can see Cocopelli House across the canyon. On top of the canyon there, on the other side, is Sun Temple. There's another canyon just behind that has Oak Tree House, New Fire House, and Fire Temple. 3 different dwellings. Balcony House is on top of this mesa, just a half mile in that direction. And so this wasn't just an isolated village, it was more like the New York City of Mesa Verde. People were coming from all over here to hang out. That's where it all was going on. But they eventually left this place, and some people believe that they left for some of the same reasons that drove them down here in the first place. Maybe their populations were just continuing to expand, and they ran out of room for fertile cropland. They ran out of resources, out of their seep springs for everyone. Maybe that deforestation was a huge issue. People had to travel miles and miles away just to grab fuel for the firewood. Maybe soil degradation was an issue. They're planting a lot of corn here, and that's a very intensive crop. Maybe the soil started to lose some fertility. But all of these combination facts together, plus drought, was most likely why they left. Towards the end of their stay here, a 25-year drought took place, and that dried up their seep springs, killed off their crops, and pretty much just stressed out their society enough to where they would want to move away. And they did. They moved south into Arizona, into New Mexico, where the modern Pueblo tribes are still living today. And what they found further south were lower elevations, which would be a longer growing season. They found the Rio Grande River flowing through northern New Mexico, so that might be a more permanent source of water. But after the people left here, Cliff Palace sat vacant for about 600 more years. So if you imagine what your house would look like with 600 years of no maintenance, probably won't look this good. But it stood up to time. But after the Pueblo people left this area, more people moved in. The Ute Mountain Ute tribe came in, and also the Navajo. But they were in this area, but they never entered the dwellings because they felt that they would disturb the spirits that were still living here today. So they stayed away. And it wasn't until the late 1880s when Western civilization started moving back out into this area. It was a family of ranchers, the Wetherill family, that moved in around where Memphis is today. And they were very friendly people. They befriended the Ute Mountain Ute tribe that was here. And in return, the Utes allowed them to graze their cattle here in this area. Very rare for that day and age, but they told them to keep an eye out for the houses in the cliffs. And so as the legend has it, it was December 1888. It was snowing like crazy that day. Richard Wetherill and his brother-in-law Charlie Mason were out riding horses along the ridge across the canyon here. And looking through the trees through the snow and across the canyon, they saw Cliff Palace just sitting in its vacancy with its empty doorway, just staring down. However, when someone discovers something really cool like Cliff Palace, there's always someone else that says they were the first ones here. So we don't really know if they were the first white people to see it, but they were the first ones to start publicizing the area, bringing more people in. But they were kind of a product of their day as well. Back then, it was very common for people to gather large amounts of artifacts and simply sell them to museums for a quick buck. And so that encouraged a lot of people to come down here and find things and sell them. So much so that people were coming in and blowing holes in the walls with dynamite to go in and take artifacts away. So a lot of damage was happening here. People were even coming here for parties and picnics and dances. So a lot of things, a lot of bad things happening. But it wasn't until 1893 when a man named Gustav Nordenskjöld came into this area. He was from Sweden. He was an amateur archaeologist, and he taught the Wetherills the art and the science of archaeology. They made extensive collections throughout this park. Nordenskjöld made lots of notes, and even wrote a book on this area. But then when he wanted to take his artifacts back home, overseas, he packed them up in a boxcar and started shipping them out east. But he was stopped in Durango for the night, where he was arrested there. They did not want him to take these artifacts out of the park and out of the country. And so they arrested him, but while he was sitting in jail, they realized they had nothing to hold him on. He had broken no laws as of yet. And so they had to let him go, and his artifacts are in Helsinki, Finland today, still overseas. So that left a really bad taste in everyone's mouth. They did not want him to take these things away. So that started getting support for the Antiquities Act. And that was the first archaeological law passed, and it protected these places. It made it illegal to take things away. And after that, the land was set aside for this park shortly after that act was passed. And so as the park was founded, more and more visitors started to come out. And then we had to be concerned with safety, because we can't have everyone here today in this site with a wall getting ready to fall on top of everybody. And so a man named Dr. Jesse Fuchs came through, and it was his task of stabilizing this site. He was the first one here. And what they did, they used a process called repointing.